Terrestrial Ecology notes. This is video notes 1. We're going to go through slides 1 through 20. Okay, so ecology is a study of connections in nature. We're looking not necessarily at the biology of the animals unless it relates to how they interact. We're focusing on animals' interactions between each other, between their non-living environment. How do they fit into the ecosystem around them? So if you look at this side over here, and you're looking at the different types of science which you're studying, you start down here with the molecular chemistry, with the microbiologists moving up here, with the biologists and the zoologists here, and now we're getting to the ecology here. So this is where we are on the infrastructure, essentially, of biological science, and then we move up into the larger stuff, which is a whole nother ballgame. Okay, so organisms are different forms of life classified into different species based on those characteristics. So the current classification system right now is getting better and better at classifying species. We classify species based on a whole bunch of characteristics right now. We focus on genetics, and you can't see that. Let me switch. There we go. We focus on genetics. We also look at evolution, evolutionary relationships. We look at internal and external anatomy. And to some extent, we look at their habitat or niche surrounding the species. But these things right here are the key characteristics, especially genetics, in determining whether an organism is species A or species B. Actually, let me back up for a minute. So if you're looking at the different critters right now, by far you can see insects take up the vast majority, invertebrates are the vast majority of species on the planet right now. Plants are a good section, and then all of this are the vertebrate species, the amphibians, the fish, and the mammals. So if you're thinking about this, you've got invertebrates. If you're thinking about the main groups, you've got inverts, and then you've got fish. You've got amphibians, you've got reptiles, you've got birds, and you've got mammals. So there are 5 main groups of vertebrates, and then a whole bunch, depending on how you organize them, of invertebrates, insects by far being the most. You've also got kingdom fungi, you've got protists. Sorry, protists are down here. Protists right here. Kingdom Plantae, and then you've got the prokaryotes, which are split into a couple different kingdoms and domains. Okay, so a biological community is essentially one ecosystem and one group, one area. They differ in the types and number of species they contain. I mean, you think about it. The rainforest has a very high biodiversity, whereas the desert or tundra has a relatively low biodiversity. The ecological roles that those species play also varies based on the environment and based on the species. So species diversity is a number of different species it contains. A much more common term for that is biodiversity. So if I refer to biodiversity and species diversity, same thing. Species richness, exactly what it sounds like. How many species does an ecosystem contain? Combined with the abundance of individuals within each of those species. So it's species evenness. So there are a lot of, that kind of relates back to, in a way, back to density, population density. Where are the species in the ecosystem? Does one ecosystem have a whole bunch, whereas another does not have a whole bunch of those species? Stuff like that. Okay, so indicator species are species that kind of pop out and show us what's going on with an ecosystem. They're an early warning. If you see this species die off all of a sudden, that's an early warning that something's going on with the ecosystem. There's some kind of problem. If you see that species population expand dramatically, what's going on? That's a warning system. Something is out of whack in that ecosystem. Usually these species are sensitive. They're one of the first ones to die off or first ones to respond to extra resources because they're more sensitive than other species. So if something happens that they're not getting what they need, for example, trout species are very sensitive to temperature and oxygen. So if the temperature goes up too far or the oxygen levels go down too far, or vice versa even, the trout is going to die off. And therefore, that gives you a really good early warning something's going on with that water because there aren't any trout in that water anymore. Okay, so the case study of the amphibians. Amphibians are a huge problem right now. A lot of amphibian species, especially in key places like the rainforest in Central America, are just disappearing. I mean, we're losing tons and tons of species of amphibians almost overnight. They're an indicator species because their life cycle is so different. You've got an aquatic stage and a terrestrial stage. You require water for healthy eggs to be fertilized. You require water for the tadpoles. So if anything is going on in any one of these systems, then they're not going to make it, and you're not going to see the frog species anymore. So due to increased pollution, due to loss of habitat, we're seeing the disappearance of incredible numbers of amphibians. So like I said, habitat loss, fragmentation, drought. If there's no water, they can't lay eggs. The tadpoles can't survive. Pollution, radiation increases. Parasites are a huge one, and the viral and fungal diseases are a huge one. We're seeing a lot more frogs and toads with 3 legs, with weird heads, with missing limbs, just really weird deformities that are coming from these diseases and these parasites, but especially these diseases hitting the genetics and just totally messing with them. Overhunting, believe it or not, especially around here, a lot of the Cajun, influence, and they're not really a controlled species. So we're seeing a loss due to overhunting. And then the non-native competition is driving a lot of them out. So we'll talk about invasive species a little bit later. Keystone species are major players. They help determine the types and the numbers of other species in a community and therefore help to sustain it. So one of the big ones, the big example that you guys can be familiar with is the sea otter in the kelp forest. Okay, so the kelp forest is has a high biodiversity, lots of different species, and it's based on the kelp plant. So what happens, the basic chain, is that this kelp plant is eaten by sea urchins, and then the sea urchins in turn are eaten by the sea otters. Well, the sea otter is a keystone species. When the sea otters go away, and they are disappearing from the hunting, from the for their pelts, stuff like that, as the sea otters declined, the sea urchins population jumped through the roof, which means that all the kelp was eaten up, which means that kelp forest, the whole ecosystem, disappeared. So without this key species, you lose essentially a whole ecosystem, because the whole ecosystem is based on this kelp plant that's food to not only the sea urchins but a whole bunch of other invertebrates and fish, and also protection and habitat, and just this whole thing just breaks down without the sea otter. So they serve to work as a keystone species. Other major players, foundation species. You kind of expand the whole concept of a keystone species, and those foundation species create and enhance habitats that benefit other species. So if you want to go back to our kelp forest, the kelp would be the foundation species in this one. If you want to talk about like elephants in a forest, if you're looking at Asian or African elephants, they mess with trees to eat, to play, whatever, and that creates openings in the forest that promotes grass growth for other species to utilize, and kind of changes the outlook of a forest ecosystem, creates little pockets and openings for other stuff to kind of jump in there. A population, we know already, is a group of individual organisms of the same species living within a particular area. Nothing new there. A community is a population of all species living and interacting in an area. So community would be the whole ecosystem, the whole habitat in that area. And then the area you have to define. When you're talking about a community, you need to define what area you're referring to. Are you referring to the whole North America as your area? Is that one community, which it absolutely can be? Are you referring to your backyard as an area? So the area size can vary dramatically. You have to define this in order to define that. An ecosystem is a community of different species interacting together and with the chemical and physical factors making up its non-living environment. So the ecosystem, the important thing to remember in ecosystem is it has the biotic and abiotic factors. Okay, the living and the non-living. This is the water quality and the air quality, the weather, the shape of the land. Are there mountains? Are there valleys? Are there rocks? Are there dirt? Is it mud? Is it sand? What's going on with the abiotic stuff? And then in turn, that will determine the biotic, what the plant growth coverage is, and then what the animal growth and coverage is. Non-living versus living components of ecosystems. Like I said, it contains abiotic and the biotic components, and you have to look at both in order to get the full concept of the ecosystem. So like I said, you can look at the weather patterns. I'll go back. You can look at the weather patterns. You can look at the soil composition, the nutrients in the soil, the amount of water in the soil. You have to look at the plant coverage. You have to look at the animal coverage, air quality. All of that stuff goes into the whole ecosystem. So the realm of ecology, I already talked about this on our first slide. It kind of depends on where you are, but this gives you a really good diagram of the relative size of each of these terms we're talking about. So you start at the organism level, and then you go up to a population of organisms, and then a community of organisms, and then an ecosystem that adds in the biotic factors, and then a biosphere. So you see relatively the size, shape, what are we talking about with each of these terms that we're looking at. A habitat is the place where an organism or population lives. A niche is a total way of life or role of a species in an ecosystem. It's where they fit. I always think about it as how they kind of snuggle in and get comfortable. What do they need to be comfortable and happy? So it's all of the conditions. And remember, it's not just to live, but to live successfully, therefore to reproduce and continue on the population in order to be a good niche. A predator, an organism that captures and feeds on parts or all of another animal. We know that already. Just should hopefully a lot of this be review. Prey, captured and serves as a source of food for another animal. We talked about this. This goes back to the lab, like I said, that we did on Monday. A common property resource, something that's owned not by one specific person, but by pretty much everyone, available to all users, free of charge. There's not any control, not any regulations on it. Most of them are renewable, at least potentially renewable. They can be fixed. Air, open ocean, migratory birds, the whole Antarctic, because right now no one owns the Antarctic, although people argue about it all the time, but no one owns it right now. The ozone and the space are all potential common property resources. Biomass is the organic matter produced by plants. It's the dry weight, energy from wood, garbage, and agricultural waste, and we use it or can use it for electrical energy. And I think that's where we stop for video 1. So this is the end of video 1. We're ending on slide 20.